This is the first video lesson for the respiratory system. You should have already finished the module, the PDF in Google Classroom, about the respiratory structures and their functions. The goals of the respiratory structures and functions is to be able to identify in a diagram and give functions of the structures listed here, explain the role of cilia and mucus in the respiratory tract, and explain the relationship between the structures and the functions of the alveoli. There are some videos embedded in the slideshow of this presentation that cover the respiratory system very nicely. There's 2 crash course videos. They're each about 10 minutes long, and they do a great job of covering the main topics from this section. Just a little recap on the structures of the system. You can see here where the respiratory system and the digestive system share some structures. We know that air comes into the nasal cavity, and there are some functions of this nasal cavity to warm and moisten air, as well as trap particulates and dust with hair and mucus. Air also comes in through the oral cavity, through the mouth, just like food does, and they meet here in this shared area called the pharynx. This is where both the respiratory and digestive structures or systems share a passageway. Just below that pharynx, we run into the epiglottis, which is this flap that covers the top of the larynx. The epiglottis is able to close up during swallowing to protect the windpipe and allows food to travel down the esophagus. Now you'll see the esophagus is hidden back here. It's a little bit squashed behind the trachea. The esophagus is a soft and muscular structure. It doesn't have any way of staying open on its own unless food is present. Food is then pushed down the esophagus, you'll remember, using peristalsis to push that bolus down. But most of the time, the esophagus is fairly closed up. It's a narrow passageway unless food is being passed down. The trachea, or the windpipe, on the other hand, is always open. Your body prioritizes allowing air into the lungs at all times. Before air enters a trachea, though, it has to pass through the voice box or larynx. If you feel in your neck, you may feel an Adam's apple or a rigid area there, and that's your larynx. Within the larynx are 2 vocal cords, and the space between them is known as the glottis. Here, traveling down the trachea, moving into the bronchus, bronchi, bronchioles, and eventually terminating down here in these alveoli, the air sacs at the end of every branch of the bronchioles in the lungs. Also notice down here this large muscular structure. That's the diaphragm, and that's the main muscle used in breathing. Looking over here at this diagram of the alveoli, you'll see that the alveoli are these clusters of air sacs. Their spherical shapes and many small sacs allow for an increased surface area, which maximizes gas exchange. They're also covered in a surfactant, a wet, mucousy, soapy layer that allows for very efficient diffusion of gases across membranes. And then, of course, they are covered in capillaries. Blood enters from the heart through the pulmonary artery, then pulmonary arteriole. It is low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide, which it delivers here at the alveoli, then picks up oxygen and returns back to the heart, the pulmonary venule and pulmonary vein. The main part of this lesson today is about breathing. So try it out a little bit. This animation shows square breathing. It's a very relaxing way to breathe. You breathe in and hold. Breathe out and hold. This square breathing technique is actually used by Navy SEALs and lots of other people in very stressful jobs to help bring the heart rate and the stress levels in the body way down and bring the body back to baseline. So if you're feeling anxious or stressed, this is a great way to help calm your body down. Your nervous system and your respiratory system are very tightly connected. You likely notice that in times of stress or anxiety, your breathing changes. And by changing your breathing, you can also change your levels of stress or anxiety. From this lesson, you should be able to describe the mechanisms and the control of breathing, including the structures, the processes, and the role of the gases and molecules that are involved in stimulating or regulating the respiratory process. So a little more anatomy here. We're talking about thoracic anatomy. The thoracic cavity is the space in your body covered up by your rib cage. So your upper torso is your thoracic cavity. The squishy part below your rib cage is your abdominal cavity. The thoracic cavity is a sealed off cavity. It's airtight and it's bordered on the top and the sides by rigid and protective ribs and the muscles between them, which are called the intercostal muscles. There are two sets of intercostal muscles, internal and external, and they have different functions in the breathing process. The base of the thoracic cavity is formed by the diaphragm muscle and connective tissue. The diaphragm muscle stretches across from left to right and front to back, and does have a small opening in the middle that is sealed up where the esophagus passes through the diaphragm and down into the stomach. Now your lungs are nestled in your thoracic cavity within a fluid-filled pleural cavity. That cavity is formed by a double membrane called the pleura or pleural membrane. There's a visceral pleural membrane or visceral pleura that covers the lung. So it's stuck very closely to the surface of the lung. And there's a parietal pleura, parietal pleural membrane, that is stuck to the inner layer of the rib cage and diaphragm. So this is very similar to that pericardium where we had that double sock effect. Same thing is happening around your lungs. The space between those membranes is called the pleural cavity, and it's filled with fluid. That fluid helps to minimize friction between the lungs and the wall of the thoracic cavity, and also helps to maintain surface tension, which holds the lungs open, ready to receive air. So you can see here in this little tiny cutaway view, we have the visceral pleura right up against the surface of the lung, a space filled with fluid is a pleural cavity, and then the parietal pleura right up against the surface of the rib cage and intercostal muscles. Now that pleural cavity is a little bit tricky. There are a few things that can happen to it that can cause some difficulty in breathing. If it fills up with too much fluid, that can squeeze and compress the lungs and make it difficult to take in a full breath. That is called a pleural effusion. It's basically swelling excess fluid around your lungs. An infection like bacteria or pneumonia, or bacteria or viruses that cause pneumonia can cause a pleural effusion. Organ failures where your body is not clearing built up fluids quickly enough, or other types of infection can all lead to too much fluid in that pleural cavity. When that's the case, a doctor may prescribe medication to try and clear some of that swelling and excess fluid, or in extreme cases, may need to drain that excess fluid. If air gets into that pleural cavity, it's known as a pneumothorax. That can lead to a collapsed lung because it changes that surface tension and the very carefully imbalanced pressure between the internal part of the lungs and the outside environment. Most common cause of a collapsed lung is trauma or puncture to the thoracic cavity, but it can also be caused by other diseases. COPD, for example, can cause air to collect in that pleural cavity and the lungs to collapse. So ventilation or breathing has two phases. The breathing in, we call inspiration or inhalation, and that's where air is drawn into the lungs. This is an active phase. It requires muscular contraction. The main muscle of inhalation or inspiration is the diaphragm. Expiration Well, exhaling is where you're breathing out. Air is pushed out of the lungs, but this is actually a passive phase. As the muscles relax and snap back into place, air is forced out of the lungs. So the process is involved in inhalation. The main muscle driving this is the diaphragm, that large sheet of muscle that stretches across the base of the thoracic cavity. As it contracts, it flattens. So at rest, it has a dome shape, and when it's contracted, it flattens out. That increases the thoracic cavity volume. The other thing that happens during inhalation or inspiration is external intercostal muscles contract, which causes the rib bones to lift up and out. So try it. Take a deep breath in all the way to the base of your lungs and feel how your rib cage changes in shape. That change in shape comes from a changing shape of your diaphragm, lowering and flattening, and the intercostal muscles lifting your ribs up and out. As the thoracic cavity gets bigger, air is pulled into the lungs. So when you're breathing in, it is not your nose or your mouth or even your throat that's pulling the air in. That breath in actually comes from this negative pressure vacuum that's created as the size of your thoracic cavity increases. Pulls air into your lungs. When the pressure outside is greater than the pressure inside your lungs, the alveolar pressure, air will move in. Air will move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. The exhalation phase is a passive or relaxing phase. The diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relax and return to their resting positions, which means that the rib cage gets smaller and lowers, and the diaphragm reforms that dome shape. It moves up into the thoracic cavity. That decreases the volume of your thoracic cavity and forces air out of the lungs. Most breaths, this is a passive process, just the result of muscle relaxation. If you need to breathe more deeply or more rapidly, then there are internal intercostal muscles that will move the rib cage downward and inward more forcefully to push excess air out. So again, here are the muscles of inspiration. It's the external intercostals. Those are the ones here in red. And the diaphragm, which is here in pink. As the external intercostals contract, they lift up the rib cage and push it out. And the diaphragm contracts to change from this dome shape to a flattened shape. Expiration is mostly a relaxation, just the reverse of inspiration. But there are internal intercostals, which are not shown in this diagram, but form this sort of middle section here, closer to the sternum. And those can contract and force the ribs down to push air out of the lungs. Now, the control of breathing is managed by both a regulated nervous control, similar to the pacemaker of our heart, but also signals from your body and within the circulatory system that let the brain know whether to increase the rate of respiration or decrease the rate of respiration. If more oxygen is needed, the brain can increase the respiratory rate. Typically, the average adult breathes about 12 to 20 breaths per minute. Obviously more during exertion or exercise, and a little bit less at times of rest or sleep. The nervous control of respiration is based in the respiratory center of the medulla oblongata. So this is a part of the brain that is autonomic. It is an automatic, unconscious control, this respiration. There are intermittent nerve impulses sent from the respiratory center down to the muscles involved in inspiration. The phrenic nerve sends a signal to the diaphragm to contract, and the intercostal nerves send signals to the intercostal muscles to contract. Both of those cause an inhalation. If inhalation is forced or too deep, you may feel an uncomfortable feeling, and your brain is triggered as well. That forced inhalation activates stretch receptors in the alveoli. There is a limit to how much those alveoli will increase in size before they start sending a signal through the vagus nerve back up to the brain and say, it's time to breathe out. So you can see here, two nerves coming down, our phrenic nerve down to the diaphragm, and the intercostal nerve, which branches out to every intercostal muscle. And one nerve pathway signaling back up to the respiratory center is the vagus nerve. Now, control of breathing is not entirely nervous. There's also some chemical control. There are chemoreceptors in a variety of locations around the body that sense when respiration needs to increase. Most of the time, our breathing is controlled not by the amount of oxygen in the blood, but by the amount of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide in the blood, most of it will combine with water and form carbonic acid. That H+ ion, which causes a slightly acidic environment, sends a signal to the respiratory center. A high concentration of hydrogen ions, or simply high carbon dioxide in the respiratory centers of the brain, will increase the rate of respiration. But it doesn't take a change in gas around the brain to be the only thing that controls respiration. There are also chemoreceptors in both the central and peripheral systems that detect blood gases. So down here on the arch of the aorta are these aortic bodies, which are chemoreceptors connected directly to nerves, sensory nerves. And here as well in the carotid arteries, which deliver blood to the head, there are also carotid bodies connected to sensory nerves. When they detect low oxygen or high carbon dioxide, they stimulate the respiratory center to increase respiration. Now, there are a few different types of breathing, and these have to do with the depth and control of our respiratory pathways. Depending on age, sex, and situation, different types of breathing may be activated. In times of stress, either physical or emotional, most of the time we revert to chest breaths or thoracic respiration, where breathing is generally shallow and quite rapid, and most of the movement of our chest is done through the neck and upper chest muscles. So a chest breath is a quick, shallow, kind of panicky breathing. Over time, people who rely on chest breathing more often than not, they will build up tension in the muscles around their chest and neck, which can lead to poor posture and headaches, but it also sends signals to the body, because remember that the nervous system and the respiratory system are tightly connected. And so breathing in a way that you would breathe if you were experiencing stress may cause your body to believe that even if stress isn't present, you are stressed, and you'll get that body stress response, the cortisol hormones. The contrast would be diaphragmatic breathing, that deep, slow belly breath. This is where you're really focusing on using the diaphragm to draw air into the base of the lungs. The belly dilates, it's a big belly breath, and your abdominal muscles relax. This type of breath is very common in the rest and digest stage. Kids and babies are great at it. If you've ever watched a sleeping baby, you will see a perfect example of this belly breath or diaphragmatic respiration. But adults can benefit from this as well. Regularly practicing this diaphragmatic breathing, which is part of many meditation and mindfulness practices, has a lot of physical health benefits. This slow and controlled breath can lower heart rate and blood pressure, can reduce anxiety. It also has benefits for core muscle stability. It improves your ability to tolerate intense exercise, promotes better posture, reduces tension, and it actually uses less energy. The stress hormone cortisol is triggered by stressed breathing. Stressed breathing releases more cortisol, and that's one of those positive feedback loops. It keeps spiraling and feeding back into itself. By practicing belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing, you can reduce the stress hormone. Less stress hormone causes less stressed breathing, which then further reduces the stress hormones. So by practicing a belly breath, it's actually a negative feedback loop. You're lowering your stress levels, which then lowers your stress hormones, which further lower your stress levels. If you haven't had any practice with diaphragmatic breathing, there's lots of videos and animations online that can help you out. There's even Elmo singing you a song all about belly breaths, or a guided meditation here. I hope those help. Try out some nice deep diaphragmatic breathing, and next lesson will be all about gas exchange.